Thank you so much for this amazing invitation to participate. I really appreciate it. It gave me a huge challenge to look back at my Doxiadis research that I did when I was working on my PhD and then book, and then more recently. So my title today is Ecology and Ekistics, circa 1977. I discovered this last book by Doxiadis, and I tried really hard to understand, it and sort of what to make of it. And at first I was only going to talk about that book, but I actually found it more useful to sort of look around at other books that he wrote at that time. So I'm going to quote Doxiadis. I start, quote, "We're in the middle of a major ecological crisis on a global scale. It is the first crisis of such seriousness and magnitude in historical times. The great change that has lately been achieved, which facilitates far better understanding and action, is due to the overall image of the situation that we're now able to get from space. The Skylab 3 astronauts reported to Congress a view of an Earth scarred by the activities of many an assault on the environment that they said future missions might help control," end quote. In the last decade of his life, and in part as a result of the Delos conferences, Doxiadis became increasingly concerned with the approaching ecological crisis. Ecology and Ekistics from 1977, posthumously published by his close friend and colleague, Gerald Dix, set out to call our attention to the escalating mismanagement of the planet, one that he blamed on a lack of balance, as we have said already here today, between nature and human settlements. To achieve a global ecological balance, he proposed a new synthesis between ecology and ekistics that I think deserves revisiting. My contribution today is divided into 4 sections. To explore how Doxiadis envisioned the synthesis, my first step is another look at how he came to formulate the concept of ekistics while working as a public servant during the Second World War, which also our colleague Ioanna just went over in the last talk. So, number 1, ekistic analysis, 1946. During the Second World War and German occupation, in an effort to solicit Allied help and to jumpstart the process of reconstruction, Doxiadis' team of technical experts were tasked with gathering data and documenting the harm and destruction to buildings, infrastructure, as well as the grave population loss due to malnutrition, starvation, and enemy aggression. Following the end of the war, these surveys continued, perhaps multiplied. Architects and engineers who worked at the Ministry of Reconstruction under Doxiadis were sent out to scout settlements all over Greece with a minutely detailed list of questions that were to compose ekistic analysis, a booklet published by the ministry in 1946. From the start, an important meaning of ekistics was a shift from individual buildings to settlements. Another important and novel element in setting up these scouting expeditions was that the questions were designed to cover not only the built, but also the natural and the social environments. They were precisely organized within a system that Doxiadis had presumably devised and numbered in the thousands. And I quote, the resulting reports were to be called ekistic studies, and I quote, 120,000 ekistikes meletes. It is not enough to see our settlements merely as technical projects. We need to stretch ourselves much further and seek to understand the relationships that connect the settlement with its environment, much like contemporary geography seeks to do, natural and political. But even this is not enough. Knowledge of a settlement's history is necessary, so we must enter into a study of the history of civilization and of historical geography. This is why we give our studies a new title and name them ekistic, meaning the total of all knowledge regarding settlements, end quote. From his writings, we know that Doxiadis was exasperated with a lack of knowledge about modern Greece and wished to offset and correct it, especially at the time when the country was a mere footnote to classical Greece, as one journalist recently put it. There were questions regarding buildings. What type of dwelling is it? Well-built? Mediocre? What are the foundations like? What are they made of? How thick are they? How deep do they go underground? What is the soil like? Why were they built the way they were built? Which wall materials were used? How was the roof constructed? The floor, the stairs, the openings, the walls, the colors, the way they insulated the dwelling from moisture? How did each dwelling get its water supply? From a communal source, hydragogio, or inside a dwelling, or a communal or an individual well. The scouts were to map a detailed list of languages spoken in each area. There were questions about family relationships, the position of women in local societies, the relationship between genders, education and its relationship to age, gender, and social, economic, and professional divisions, the general image about the intellectual and spiritual life of inhabitants, about civilization, social life, and the arts, about relationships at work, written and oral, between builders and their bosses, income and expenses of professional groups and associations, annual religious rituals, charities, survey of mental health, including how many suicides and incarceration, percentages of women to men regarding suicides. In addition, he asked questions about celebrations, social rituals, geography, tourism, road infrastructure. He wanted to know about farm animals. How many goats? Which type of goats? What kind of farm products? Was this production achieved? How was the production achieved? And this is just one small part of Echistic Analysis booklet. One is left wondering whether the rigor in Echistic Analysis was not influenced by the kind of order and discipline one needed in wartime, one that Doxiadis had internalized and was now trying to apply in a period of peace. Reading Echistic Analysis today, we're struck by its thoroughness. If only we could order and classify chaos, the author seems to suggest, then we could order it and thus eliminate it. Whereas military terms kept resurfacing in the very language he used even as late as his last book. Explosions, crisis, attacks, barbarisms. Number 2, balance, intention, language. We sense that during his last years at the ministry, Doxiadis faced many difficulties and tensions. One was between a relatively hermetic provincialism of post-war Athens, particularly that of his colleagues at the ministry, and his own genuine ease with opening up to the outside, and often remarked upon cosmopolitanism, which developed into an enormous reach, as we all know, to scholars, political and cultural figures beyond the borders of Greece. Following the sudden and ugly dismissal from his public duties in January 1950, this side of his personality and work was to grow as he started traveling widely and working mostly outside of Greece. Still, during the war years and the early post-war, his approach to the collection of data about modern Greece tried to get to a fine grain, a close look at the local, one that was perhaps at times excessively detailed, even obsessive. Yet the actual studies and photographs are evidence, in my mind, of a poetic approach to landscape, people, and building traditions, an interest in far more than dry research and objective data. We should note that such a poetic approach was already present during the wartime chorotaxia meetings, the circle of technical experts that took place in secrecy under Doxiadis during the German occupation, and whose members included Iorios Megas, who we see here, whose work we see here, Dimitris Pikionis, Angeliki Hadjimichali, Aris Kostadinidis, John Papaioannou, and others, and where perhaps the first inklings of Ekistics was already present. in that each member was asked to present both broad and detailed surveys of their topic of study, from new map-making techniques to ethnographic studies to architecture with a specific emphasis on the built environment. From these early meetings, language was an extremely useful tool for Doxiadis and the colleagues who participated and worked with him. Both very specific and widely applicable, language was a way of avoiding confusion and akatastasia. At times, one feels that Doxiadis wished to get so close to settlements so as to be able to literally read them, well beyond notating their morphology, a theme that one encounters with other 30th generation intellectuals in Greece, such as the great poet Odysseus Elitis, for whom language offered a way to contemplate legible landscapes. We read in Doxiadis, consider a very great number of characters as if a script in Ecology and Ekistics, end quote. It is intriguing that, and here we see some studies by Maria Zahorisiou, who was an architect who worked under Doxiadis in the Ministry of Reconstruction and did these amazing studies in Crete and in Mytilene. So there are 2 books by her published by the Benaki Museum that one can find. So what is intriguing is that this kind of quasi-ethnographic, architectural, urbanistic, ekistic studies were also taken outside of Greece with some of the early commissions in Lebanon and Iraq, a moment that I would like to investigate further in the future in my own research, where between June 57 and January 58, 2 of Doxiadis' scouts were sent to document about 1,680 towns and villages, systematically, from palaces to factories, small farm schools, hospitals, squatter settlements to dwellings, often also interiors. As Hashim Sarkis has commented, quote, even if he was commissioned to work only on housing in Lebanon, the Ekistics approach compelled Doxiadis to consider the history, economy, and geography of the country. The office records looked more like those of a National Geographic archive, end quote. The issue of language in the late 40s and 50s in Greece was, of course, complicated by the so-called language question, which was the debates between the Demotic and the Katharevousa. Doxiadis, who wrote mostly in Demotic, encouraged the collection of local words alongside buildings and material culture as a means to preserve local civilization, as we see, for example, for his support with his support for Megas, who was an ethnographer, for his studies in the Greek countryside. Gradually, one feels that language became a powerful resource for him when imagining new ways of seeing the world. Quote, we need a vocabulary which will help us understand what we say, and scales to measure all phenomena, compare them, and draw conclusions, end quote. Doxiadis' well-known propensity to coin new words and phrases such as Ekistics, Anthropopolis, Ecumenopolis, Anthropokosmos, Anthropics, Sopolis, Entopia, the fact that a glossary was necessarily found in every book attest to an affinity to language, closeness. Beyond that, one feels that language was a metaphor for order in Doxiadis, as well as a bridge or a way to resolve difficult tensions in his life and research. Part of his linguistic drive was, I believe, an interest in relationships. If only he could draft down a systematic reading, then he could have an ordering system. Or if he could draw an enormous map, then he would have all the relationships of the parts to the whole. Claiming that our mistakes were due to the fact that we have not understood these relationships within the total system, Doxiadis attempted to build a total model, the Anthropokosmos model, a giant map of relationships that he discussed briefly in Ecology and Ekistics, and that would help connections between disciplines, would classify settlements in categories according to size, and as he said, dimensions are fundamental to the Ekistic ranking of settlements, define all relationships within the system, and evaluate parts of the system and their relationships. Number 3, ecology as an ordering system. A total map of relationships leads us to the idea of ecology. Doxiadis' understanding of ecology had to do with restoring balance between man and nature, as we've already heard this morning, with an emphasis on settlements. In addition, the ways that Doxiadis discussed ecology was as if he sought to use an expanded idea of ecology as a model for Ekistics. In fact, by the time of the first Delos conference, the summer of 1963, Doxiadis had deeply understood the need for a new ecological approach and was actively trying to apply his ideas and theories to the new information and data that was increasingly presented in the journal Ekistics. See, for instance, a whole journal, a whole issue called Man and Nature from March 69, another one, Ecosystems, April 1970, etc. Doxiadis incorporated ecology in his ongoing analysis of Ekistics, and I quote, "Instead of thinking of urban planning and considering human needs only, we must try Ekistic planning, which includes nature and can lead us to the balance that we need between nature and anthropos." And elsewhere he said, "We badly need to save examples of all types of natural areas without an ultimate goal. But we know that it cannot quickly be achieved. What can we do now? Developing ecology as quickly as possible in all its aspects as part of our whole system of knowledge," end quote. Both agency and responsibility rested on humans. Nature remained one of the 5 elements of Ekistics, one that he considered, as we heard before, a frame, those were the words he used, or a foundation for man and his settlements. The very language of humanism that Doxiadis was so much a part of historically assigned a special status on man, anthropos, at the top of a pyramid of species and relationships. And this is a quote from Doxiadis, who is quoting Protagoras: "In all of this, mankind must be the measure." Ecology today paints a very different, more humbling picture, contradicting the scala naturae and its use in humanistic discourse, and advocates a respect for otherness, human domination of life forms, the idea of man's privileged position at the top of a kind of ladder is no longer, we no longer talk about it in this way. In nature, there is simply no higher or lower, first or second, better or worse. Doxiadis saw balance as an improved relationship between man, anthropos, and nature. I propose that our challenge today, I'd like to suggest, is to recover a language of settlements that will be appropriate to our own understanding of ecology. We need a new language free from man-centric humanism that incorporates ecological humility, however incompletely. As Christopher Maines writes, who is an environmental historian, we need to find other ways to talk about human freedom, worth, and purpose without eclipsing, depreciating, and objectifying the non-human world, end quote. Yet Doxiadis foresaw and seemed open to considering less human-centric hierarchies. Mentioning Christopher Stone's book, Should Trees Have Legal Standing, from 1974, and imagine that this question would become more and more important in the near future, but sadly he was not to live long enough to see that. Number 4, action. Quote, "It is abundantly clear that the capacity of our container is fixed, this is Doxiadis, in terms of space and basic resources, such as soil, water, and air. What we can never recycle is terrestrial space, nor can we expand it. The second great problem, perhaps even more dangerous than the first because it is very specific, is that we may overlook the greatest limitation of our globe, which is that its usable space is finite, end quote. Doxiadis and other Delians touted an emerging ecological awareness, an engagement with vital issues of their day, and a cultural imagination that we may learn from today. Their many books and documents merit new study and might contribute to a better understanding of the history of relationships between the built and natural environments and provide us with new humanist readings and perspectives. Another way to view Doxiadis' understanding of ecology is to see architecture as an instrument of social and political life, a way to build better political, ethical, and educational systems. In Action, the last Red Book, he wrote, "We think that housing has to be of a certain standard to be built. I know a country which has a regulation, then unless a house is above a certain standard, it cannot be built in its capital. This is like saying that unless a poor person has 2,500 calories per day to eat, he should not be allowed to eat." And in the penultimate Red Book, Building Utopia, he said, and I quote, "We must conceive Utopia, the city for our place on earth. This action cannot be taken by the so-called developed nations alone, because they are not in fact developed. If they were, they would be finished, but they're not. They have a long road to travel for full scientific, economic, and technological development, and a much longer and more difficult road for their cultural and humanistic development, saving their past, creating their future. On this road, they will have to remember that some of the so-called developing nations may have a much lower income, but in them, culture and nature have not suffered so much. It is possible for these nations to move ahead more quickly towards a full development of the whole system of life," end quote. Today, our ability to collect reams of data about the Earth, the oceans, and all their inhabitants is rapidly changing how we perceive and quantify our world. In this new context, what could the key be to how we read settlements, so as to understand them as being alive, as Doxiadis did, as a system of life, and important in the production of the subjects who inhabit them? Might new readings of ecology and ekistics today help us ask again how the built environment impacts society and culture? How do we construct a new kind of settlement ecology? How do environmental forces shape man? In considering these questions, we may do well to look again at some of the old issues of ekistics, to read, for example, from Eugene Odum, The Strategy of Ecosystem Development, from René Dubos, writing on how unequal distribution of income and wealth, as well as unequal access to resources, leads to poverty, and poverty then leads to environmental degradation. The relationship between chronic and degenerative disease patterns to environmental forces, also Dubos wrote about that. John McHale's discussion of how the physical and biological concepts of ecology need to also include the social behavior of man, that he saw as a critical factor in understanding of ecology. Bateson's Mind and Eco-Psychology, Barbara Ward and Buckminster Fuller's Spaceship Earth, Margaret Mead, Ernst Schumacher's Appropriate Technology, Small is Beautiful, and so many others. All of those are in the Ekistics journals. Remarkably, by today, few of the questions posed in the 60s and 70s have been addressed, whereas many retain their relevance. We might read Doxiadis' last book as a kind of meditation on how one lives in tension, especially towards the end of life. And he said, "As I have said, The highways take us far out, but we have lost the freedom to cross the street. We have a Dionysian explosion of the spirit, but we lose our wisdom, our synthesis, our Apollonian balance. End quote. How might we take these questions further today? How can we raise a collective consciousness about the serious ecological crisis we are experiencing already? For us, as Doxiadis and other Dilians insisted, we do have agency and can affect positive change. Perhaps most of all, we may still work on and learn to read settlements, even untidy ones, through the lenses of different disciplines and in fine grain as systems of life that we can act upon and modify with our contemporary expanded understandings of ecology and sustainability. Thank you.